Hello, and welcome to this episode of Asian World Podcast with Dr. Michael Hawkins. Today we'll be discussing the foundations of Southeast Asia, Part 2. Last time we discussed patron-clientism as one of the primary filters or pillars of Southeast Asian culture through which everything else that comes to the region is filtered. So whether we get waves of Indic, waves of Chinese, waves of Arab influence, Western imperialism, everything is filtered through the prism of patron-clientism. There's another prism equally as important, which very much dictates and mediates any influences that come into the region. And that second pillar is gender. Most of Southeast Asian culture is characterized by what we call a gyno-centric or matri-focal culture. Now, this is not what we'd call matriarchy, right? And most scholars of Southeast Asia don't like to say matriarchy because it conjures up these images of an extreme power structure of women chieftains and Wonder Woman style stuff. And that's not how this works. And so it's generally referred to as matri-focal, right? Or gyno-centric. But essentially what it means is that the power dynamics of gender culture tend decidedly towards women. And in that way, women very much, in most of the essential ways traditionally in Southeast Asia, and in many ways today, dictate the culture. From commerce to family, and in many cases, even politics. Now, we'll reconcile this with the big man theory of politics at the end, but Southeast Asia is decidedly matri-focal. It's interesting because from a Western perspective, sort of modern and postmodern perspective, Southeast Asia could be considered to be the most gender enlightened place on the planet for a number of reasons. Number one, and most important, kinship in Southeast Asia traditionally has been what's called bilateral, or cognatic kinship. And what this means is that the maternal line, who your mother is at least as important, if not more important, than who your father is. Now, this in and of itself is exactly the opposite of patriarchy. The term patriarchy has been sort of diluted to include loads and loads and loads and loads of stuff. But really what patriarchy is it's a kinship system that's designed to retain asset holdings within a paternal kinship line. Right? Meaning that this man inherited the property from his father and grandfather. This man wants to transmit that asset, all the wealth and all the property, to someone within his bloodline in the paternal line, meaning that he'll give it to his first son or one of his sons. Now, within the system of patriarchy, women are brought in simply to provide the next male heir. And so in this system of patriarchal kinship or paternal kinship essentially sort of erases women until they arrive at their married into kinship, right? So if you take an extreme example, some of you might have read this. If you haven't, definitely read it. But Yung Chang's wonderful memoir, Wild Swans, she talks a little bit about her grandmother, Yu Feng, who when she was born wasn't even given a name. She was called number 2 girl. And the idea is in this extreme patriarchal kinship system, when you have a little girl, she's not really a relative. You're raising her for someone else. And then when the matchmaker comes along and you make a connection, then she marries into a family and only then will she receive her true familial identity. And she'll take the husband's name and she'll identify with the husband's family and so will the children. And so effectively what this patriarchal line does is it takes women from other kinship networks, dissolves their identity or they never had an identity to begin with, and then it gives them the identity within the paternal line, right? So everything harkens back along the single line. In Southeast Asia, this is absolutely not the case. Who your mother is and that line is as important, if not, we'll get to this, more important than who the paternal line is. So that in and of itself really subverts any kind of established foundational kinship-based patriarchy. But in addition to being matri-focal, Southeast Asia is traditionally what's called matri-local. And this is almost as important as the cognatic kinship. Now, what that means is the expectation is when two people get married, the husband goes, lives, and works with the wife's family. And therefore, the children that are born of that union grow up around the maternal line and come to identify with the maternal family. It's where they grow up. It's where they invest. And that becomes the primary identity. This completely changes the power dynamics of marriage, courtship, everything. So think about it. If I live in a patriarchal kinship system, I find a matchmaker that has a family in mind, and they bring the little girl, and we arrange a marriage, and several years later we get married, and I don't really care about her line, and whoever she is, she's just supposed to bear me a son. If you think about China, for example. However, when it is matri-focal, if I am a young man and I am looking for marriage prospects, I'm not just looking for someone to produce sons. I'm looking for a woman of power and status, a family that I want to marry into, because that's where I'm going to live. That's where I'm going to work. That's where my children will identify. This decidedly swings the power towards the women in terms of kinship, courtship, and family. Meaning that if I'm a guy, now I'm looking for a beneficial marriage. Therefore, you have the classic and beautiful courtship rituals of Southeast Asia. When I take my students on study abroad to Southeast Asia, they'll sometimes see the novellas, or they'll see it in actual life in the countryside, where a boy, when he wants a woman, when he's in love with a girl, courtship in Southeast Asia is, you better sell out. I mean, you better go all the way with this. Don't play coy. Don't play hard to get. No. You immediately, if you want to catch a woman's attention, you have outrageous professions of love. You tell her that you'll love her. You tell her you'll die for her. You'll do anything for her. You bring her gifts. You sing to her below the balcony. You come and you subject yourself to the abuse of her family. You bring her gifts. You bring her father gifts. You bring her mother gifts. You work. You do anything you possibly can. And, she'll take it. She'll consider it. I don't know. How worthy are you? How dedicated are you? And the family of the woman, of course, looks at the man as well and says, how much do you want to be a part of this family? You need to prove that. And it's not uncommon for powerful women from powerful families to have multiple suitors, all of them vying for her heart or vying for a place in this wonderful family, in this powerful family, where they can see themselves marrying, working, and raising their children. And so courtship in Southeast Asia is decidedly oriented towards a woman. It was funny, I took my students on study abroad, and some of them observed this, and they were just astounded. I mean, it's not as much of a ritual as it was, I guess, in former times, but there were several girls that were like, I've never even been asked out on a date properly. Look at these guys. They're completely selling out. But the outrageous affections right from the outset, the professions of love were somewhat jarring to him as well. But the idea is that the woman has the power. You pursue to be in her family. You're going to live with her family. The kids are going to identify with her family. Therefore, she holds the power. Next, most Southeast Asian languages, particularly of the Austronesian family, are essentially genderless. Now, I know this sounds interesting, but they are. So, for example, in Tagalog, Filipino, there is no word for he or she. There's only siya, yeah, kanya, depending on the inflection. There is no word for brother or sister. There is only kapatid, sibling. There's no word for husband or wife. There's only asawa, spouse. And so the languages themselves are essentially genderless. Now, this doesn't mean that gender doesn't play a part. It's just buried way back in other linguistic symbols in the conversation. If you've ever learned a Southeast Asian language, an Austronesian language, you know what I'm talking about. It can be tough at first. I can remember after living in the Philippines for about 6 months, I felt like I was pretty fluent. I understood most of what everybody was saying. And I can remember having a conversation where they'd be talking about this or that. And I understood all the words. I knew what they were saying. But somehow the story didn't make sense. And I'd have to pause and say, wait a minute, I'm sorry, but you got to tell me, are we talking about a girl or are we talking about a boy? And they look at me like I'm crazy. They're like, I don't know what you mean. And I'm like, well, I got to know. Like, what are we talking about? Like, the world doesn't make sense to me unless I know. And then they try to accommodate. It's really funny. It's like, oh, sige, ang kapatid ko na babae, right? My sibling that is a girl did this and did that. But after you become embedded in the language and competent actually in the linguistic symbols, it doesn't matter. I mean, you realize that whether they're talking about a girl and a boy, you know that. But it doesn't play the linguistic prominence that it plays in other language. And so the whole sort of maybe biases of gender are buried way in the background of Austronesian languages and really don't play a prominent role in the everyday language and linguistic symbols that structure society. Now, just because I say that doesn't mean that Southeast Asia is androgynous or that Southeast Asians don't have gender roles, because historically in Southeast Asia, the gender roles are extreme and highly visible and adhered to. However, they're definitely, given the power dynamics of marriage and kinship and courtship and children and all that, they're definitely on the other side of what more patriarchal societies are used to. For example, women are thought in Southeast Asia to be naturally responsible, nurturing, intelligent, insightful, morally upright, not given to peer pressure, good with money, entrepreneurial, industrious, clear-headed, and in every way just good people, born into this world, good, dependable, responsible people. Men, on the other hand, are generally thought to be naturally frivolous, irresponsible, morally weak, given to peer pressure, bad with money, lazy, short-sighted, and generally children in need of firm governance from a strong woman. It's funny, traditionally in Southeast Asia, women have categorically controlled the households. All commerce in Southeast Asia traditionally is done by women. Even today, I take my students to markets in Southeast Asia, and it is a vast sea of women making deals, looking out for the family's interest, holding the money, making the money, investing the money, buying product, parlaying that product. Women are the movers and shakers of commerce in Southeast Asia. Because of this, women will categorically control the households in the region, meaning that they make all the major decisions about expenditures. They make all the major decisions about where to live, what to do, what businesses to invest in. And traditionally in Southeast Asia, what happens is a woman will give a man his allowance. They'll say, here's your money. Now, of course, Southeast Asia being patron clientism, his buddies will come by, his barcada, right? And they say, hey, man, let's go do something. Let's go out. And so they go out. And of course, building social networks, he buys drinks, he does little favors, he loans his buddy, this or that. And then he comes back and he tells his wife, hey, I don't have any money. I need more money. Can I have some more money? And the wife says, no, you cannot. I gave you money. You used your money. You cannot have any more money. And the guy says, well, I need money. And the wife says, no, you cannot have it. And the idea is, if you give a man all the money, his buddies will come by and he's not going to be thinking about the kids. He's not going to be thinking about the future. It's just going to blow away with the wind. And so the woman jealously holds the household funds responsibly, doling them out, moderating them, thinking of the future, thinking of the children, thinking of business opportunities, thinking of her entrepreneurial spirit. And the man has to be reined in. There's some really cool research going on right now about the labor diaspora. So if you didn't know this, the labor diaspora out of Southeast Asia is about 86% female. And so many of these Southeast Asian women are going abroad to Rome, to China, to Dubai, to the United States, of course, and to Canada, where they're working in a variety of jobs. And what happens is these women will come on a particular labor contract and they'll make money, and then they send money home in the form of remittances to their family to give their children a better opportunity at education and everything else. And so what happens is the women will get a phone call and the husband will say, oh, hey, man, I need $500. We got to pay Jing Jing's tuition. I also have the payment on the motorcycle, and then the electric bill is due. Can you send me that? The wife says, sure. And so she sends him the remittance. 10 days later, she gets a call. Husband says, oh gosh, I need some money right away. Jing Jing's tuition hasn't been paid, and I still need the motorcycle is behind. And the wife says, whoa, wait a minute. Wait, I sent you money for that. You didn't do that? And he goes, what? You did? She says, yes, of course. You should have paid it. And he goes, oh, I don't know. Something else came up. I'm not sure. I can't remember. But anyway, I need to pay the tuition. Can you send more money? And so these women are at their wits' end, right? They're working overtime. They're trying all this. And so there's all these really interesting technologies that are coming around where women can make direct payments to the school, or they can make direct payments to the electric company, or they can acquire digital receipts and have reporting on the expenditures. And so even from 8,000 miles away, these sort of strong, dominant Southeast Asian women are still managing the household finances. It's really amazing to see it play out over these long stretches in the diaspora. Pretty amazing. Next on our list of why women in Southeast Asia could be considered the most perhaps liberated according to a Western concept of feminism, is that in Southeast Asia, the highest achievement that a human being, not just a woman, but a human being can have is to conceive and bear life. The greatest achievement in Southeast Asia is motherhood. Now, this is common to a lot of areas of the world which perhaps have some strong animistic foundations, because when you get outside of institutionalized religions and you have sort of informal animistic belief systems much more in tune with the cosmos, the earth, you can't help but notice that women are a microcosm of the cosmos itself. They conceive and they bear life. They produce food. They cycle roughly in the same way that the moon does. Everything about them seems to be in tune with this sort of cosmic thread. And so in Southeast Asia, traditionally, the greatest miracle, the greatest achievement is to bear a child. You can't do better than that. You can't get higher than that. And so one of the most cherished figures, one of the most cherished icons in Southeast Asia is a mother. That's the zenith of the human experience. And I think a lot of this is borne out, particularly if you look at the post-colonial period and you see the astounding number of female heads of state. So whether we're talking about Megawati or Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, or I think one of the best examples of this is Cory Aquino. And she's worth looking at. So in my last lecture, if you listen to that one, I talked about the dictator Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. By the time we got to the mid-'80s, Marcos was completely out of control. I mean, he was killing political rivals and causing all kinds of trouble. And so he had a rival named Ninoy Aquino who'd been in exile in the United States and Massachusetts. And Ninoy Aquino decided to come back to the Philippines to challenge him. And when Ninoy Aquino got to the Philippines, as soon as he stepped off the plane, he was assassinated. Well, when he was assassinated, there was a gigantic uproar, not only in the Philippines, but globally. It was such a pronounced and prominent assassination of a political rival. And in response to the outrage, Marcos agreed to snap elections. He said, okay, well, we'll have a snap election and I'll prove to the world that the Filipino people are still behind me, that there was nothing to this. They decided to run Ninoy's widow, a woman named Cory Aquino. Now, when she was running against Marcos at the very outset, when the information came down, there were many hands wringing and heads shaking in the State Department of the United States. They thought, oh my gosh, what is going on here? She is going to get eaten alive. Because if you knew Cory Aquino, she didn't come off as a political tiger. As a matter of fact, her highest joy in life was to be a housemaker. She dressed in these sort of beautiful little conservative dresses, and she wore pearls, and she wore the sort of librarian glasses and had the chain that came down and went around the back of her neck. And when Ninoy was in Boston discussing all these matters of consequence and world politics in the Philippines with guests, Cory would say, well, I don't really want to do the conversation. I'll go make you tea and some cucumber sandwiches. And she would come back, and she was sort of if you were to go back to second wave feminists' idea of the quintessential housefrau, right? Everything they seemed to despise in the 1960s and 70s, Cory happily embodied. And so when she is pitted against Marcos in this sort of life or death struggle for democracy in the Philippines, people all over the world thought, oh my gosh, what is going on? She is going to get eaten alive. Marcos is a killer. Cory is a housewife. But nobody understood. Cory is a tiger. Cory is a mom in Southeast Asia. And so when she would get up and she would give these speeches, there would be tens of thousands of people listening to her, and she would rail against the Marcos regime and rail against his excesses. And at the end of the speech, very famously, she would pound on the pulpit, she would point at the crowd, and she would say, "Tama na, sobra na." Now, if you're Filipino, the hairs on your arm just stood up, because when your mother has had enough, when she has told you 3 times to stop and you refuse to listen to her, your mother will turn to you with a stern face and say, "Tama na, that's enough, sobra na, you've gone too far." And she's going to take off her chinela and she's going to beat you to death, right? This is going to be the end of times because she has gone over the edge. You have pushed her too far. When Cory pounds the pulpit and says this, millions of Filipinos look at her and they say, you know what? That's exactly what we need. We need a mom. We can't do better than a mom. if this country is going to be saved, it'll be saved by a mom. They believe this so much that in February of 1986, millions of Filipinos flooded onto EDSA Avenue. And in the face of machine guns and brutal military repression, knelt down, took out their rosaries, and dared the Marcos regime to shoot them down in the streets for a mom. And so in Southeast Asia, there is no higher achievement than that. Now, what's interesting is this marks a sharp departure from second wave, and in some ways even third wave feminism in the West. In the 1960s, motherhood was viewed largely as a handicap, that it's something that keeps you bound and barefoot and inhibited and prevents you from fulfilling your full potential as a human being. And the sort of second wave feminist idea was, if I'm going to be a liberated woman, I have to shed these feminine qualities of domesticity, and I have to act much more like a man. I have to swear, I have to spit, I have to fight, I have to be willing to kill people. I have to sort of fulfill these symbols of masculine power that have allowed men to dictate much of the world. In Southeast Asia, they really represent a sharp departure from this. In Southeast Asia, women to become liberated do not look to masculinity, right? If you're a Southeast Asian woman, you say, like, wow, why would I want to shed my femininity? Why would I want to become more like a man? They're idiots. I want to be feminine. I want to be a woman. I want to be a mother. And so this has been an interesting debate back and forth in some of the literature on feminism in Southeast Asia. And particularly Westerners go over and they look through the lens of gender as we understand it, but really fail to grasp the true dimensions and beauty of a matri-focal or gyno-centric gender system in Southeast Asia. Now, there is one more aspect of gender culture in Southeast Asia that could be considered to be, by Western standards, incredibly enlightened. Now, I'm going to give it to you, but you got to listen to me rant for 30 seconds after. The last element, which is really an indicator of a matri-focal or gyno-centric culture in Southeast Asia, is gyno-centric sexuality. Now, what I mean by that is sexuality in Southeast Asia, whether in practice, in symbol, or cosmologically within religion, is geared towards one purpose, and that is satisfying a woman. Now, again, this is starkly the opposite of a paternal or patriarchally dominated society in which sexuality is entirely geared towards satisfying men. In Southeast Asia, it is all about pleasing a woman. So, for example, traditionally in Southeast Asia, married couples, a woman could divorce her husband for failing to please her, for being impotent, for failing to give her children, in any way failing to please her sexually. That was grounds for divorce. There's this really fascinating and interesting history in Southeast Asia on penile implants. Now, I do gender and sexuality. If it does make you a little uncomfortable, skip this part. To me, I don't mind because it's interesting. But if it does, maybe hit the 30-second forward button on the podcast. There's this great history throughout Southeast Asia on body alteration and penile implants. Really fascinating how women in particular societies in Southeast Asia would force their husbands to alter their penises. Some of the most famous was they had to pierce them and put in a little brass spur, or they had to get a ring, or there's very famously, they would insert little brass balls or little brass bells in geometric design under the skin of the penis to produce girth and size. And also as a means of foreplay, the men would oftentimes have to dance to make a sort of tinkling sound. And so there's this extensive history, and it'll strike you as funny maybe because it's exactly the opposite of what we are used to. To cater to men's sexuality in the West, women have traditionally been called upon to alter their bodies, either permanently or through a variety of garments and aids. In Southeast Asia, it was the opposite. We also get extreme examples of men having to please women on a cosmological level. So, for example, if you go to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, you're going to see the Sivalinga, you're going to see the phallic symbol everywhere you go. Now, again, as a Westerner, you show up and you say, oh my gosh, what a horrible thing. Everywhere they go, they're obsessed with penises. This is just obscene and male-dominated and phallocentric. That's not the case. The phallic symbols are meant to represent potency in as much as they can please a woman. So very famously, in that great Khmer civilization, The cosmos, the god of the cosmos, the Naga princess, was thought to come down in the form of a beautiful woman and appear in the temple, at which point the king of Angkor had to satisfy her sexually many times to guarantee the prosperity of the kingdom. And so his power was only in as much as his potency was able to satisfy the woman that represented the cosmos and all the blessings that come therefrom. Same thing is exactly true with all the phallic symbols in Southeast Asia. It's not a phallocentric, it's phallic symbols that are meant to satisfy women. There is an incredible article by Mary Beth Mills, which everybody should read, called Attack of the Widow Ghost. And in it, she goes to this Thai village where the young men are suffering from sleep paralysis that kills them. And it's something that happens in Southeast Asia. In the Philippines, they call it bangungot. And you go to sleep and you're sort of trapped within your dream and you die from terror because you can't wake up. And it struck this Thai village particularly severe. And the idea was that there were these widow ghosts, or these female ghosts that had a sort of insatiable sexual hunger that could not be satisfied. And so they were dragging these young men into the afterlife where they could be satisfied. Well, in order to prevent this, the villagers put up phallic symbols everywhere, everything from fence posts to light posts, and they created penises, and they made realistic ones, and they made symbolic ones. And the idea was the hope that the widow ghost would come back and be satisfied by all of these phalluses and would leave the young men alone. So even though, a Westerner would walk into the village and say, oh, look at this phallocentric. This is so stupid. This is so male dominant. No, that's not what it's about. It's about satisfying the woman. Now, permit me the rant. One of the things that irritates me most about teaching this or seeing interpretations of this is in the West, particularly with our media and social media and everything, we are in many ways completely incapable of understanding a true matri-focal or gyno-centric culture. And so a lot of times the way this is interpreted is you get people that go to Southeast Asia and they will say the most obscenely obnoxious things like, oh my gosh, Southeast Asia is just sort of a sexual paradise and all the women in Southeast Asia are sexually stimulated and it's so great to go there and all the women are free in their sexuality and they fetishize Southeast Asian women and they depict them in films as these sort of nymphomaniac women. And it irritates me really bad on two levels. Number one, you get idiots that go over there and will have women come up to them and want to be with them and all this. And they think they're all of a sudden the biggest, lady killers that ever lived. And they want to tell people about this. At which point I want to grab them by the throat and I want to say, hey, she's not into you. She's poor. Do you understand that? She's poor. She needs help. And you're exploiting her poverty by taking advantage of her sexuality, which may be the only thing she has to offer. That makes you a bad person. And the fact that you're interpreting it as they're all super sexual all the time and they're super nymphos and all, no, that makes you doubly bad. And you want to slam them against the wall. The other thing that irritates me about it is that by going over there and seeing this, what they're missing is the larger picture. If you want to talk actually about gynocentric sexuality, you want to talk about matri-focal sexuality, we go back to the beginning of this lecture, where what it means to be in a matri-focal sexual culture means that you sell out in your courtship. You tell her that you love her from the moment you see her. You go and subject yourself to her family. You identify with her family. You work with her family. You bear children for her family. That's actually gynocentric sexuality, not the bar girls depicted in Vietnam movies, not the websites that exploit the sexuality of poor people in Southeast Asia. All right, so that's my rant. Finally, to end, I know what a lot of you are thinking. You say, wow, that's crazy. That's incredible. But how do we reconcile the two filters? Like, on the one hand, you just spent a whole podcast talking about how big men of Southeast Asia run everything. And now you're giving me a podcast about how women actually run everything in Southeast Asia. Well, the two sort of work hand in hand. There is another piece that everyone needs to read by Suzanne Brenner called Why Women Rule the Roost. And she makes a really convincing argument. And essentially what it is that a big man in Southeast Asia only succeed in as much as they have a strong woman to protect them from their natural instincts. So if you have a big man and he doesn't have a strong woman behind him that can rein him in and advise him when he's being stupid, he will blow all his clientele in a matter of years. Nobody will be left. But if you have a big man who's powerful and he has a woman at home that can help rein in his natural inclinations towards frivolity and excess and amorality, and only then is he a big man. And so the two sort of fit together sort of perfectly, where the woman is the one that guides the man. The man is the one that, of course, builds social debt and fulfills all the requisite obligations of the big man. And so you have sort of a perfect synthesis between the two. It's a great piece. Definitely check it out. And so you can see whether it's patron clientism or whether it is gender, no matter what comes to the region, it's brought through these two filters. I think one of the best examples, I tell this to my students, is when we have the waves of Brahmanism and eventually Buddhism that wash over the region, you see that they adopt the concepts of karma, they adopt many of the gods, they adopt many of the epics and the mythologies and the rituals. But you know the two things they don't adopt? They don't adopt Varna or Jati. They don't adopt the caste system from Indic civilization because it does not fit with patron clientism. They also do not adopt the patriarchal interpretations of that religion. So whatever comes, it's always filtered through these two things. And so when we speak of Southeast Asia as being the digestive organ of the world, what metabolizes these global elements? What renders them up as something distinctly Southeast Asian is patron clientism and gender. I'm Dr. Michael Hawkins. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the Asian world. Subscribe to Asian World Podcast wherever you get your podcast, and share this episode with friends and family who share your passion for history. For more, please check out my published works, including books by Northern Illinois University Press and Cornell University Press. Join us again as we continue to unravel the mysteries and celebrate the wonders of the Asian world. Podcast recording and mixing by Weberized Podcast Productions.